cub flushed down a drainage pipe. What this human baby did put everyone in tears. Let us know where you're watching from. If you love my content, consider supporting it with a super thanks. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe. It'll help us to remain in touch with amazing people like you. The morning fog rolled thick over Willowbrook Village, muffling the familiar sounds of birds and distant cowbells. Near the old stone bridge, a drainage pipe jutted out from the muddy embankment, its rusted mouth dripping with last night's rain. The surrounding woods stood dark and silent, their ancient trees keeping secrets older than the village itself. Inside the yellow cottage beside the stream, 18-month-old Isabelle Carter bounced on her mother Avery's hip, tiny fingers wrapped around a red ball. The kitchen window overlooked the stream where the drainage pipe stuck out like a metal tongue. Avery, distracted by the morning chaos of brewing coffee and searching for Isabelle's lost pacifier, barely noticed the unusual sounds from outside. "Ba-ba-ba," Isabelle babbled, pointing toward the window. A bear cub, no bigger than a small dog, had wandered down from the forest. Its brown fur still carried morning dew as it sniffed the ground near the pipe's entrance. The cub's mother was somewhere upstream, fishing for breakfast, leaving her baby to explore the interesting smells of human habitation. 3 teenagers from the village sat on the bridge above, sharing a stolen pack of cigarettes. Ethan Marshall, the oldest at 17, flicked his lighter repeatedly, trying to impress his friends. The other 2, Logan Carter and Jacob Bennett, dangled their legs over the water, joking about last night's party. "Look at that stupid bear," Logan laughed, pointing down at the cub nosing around the drainage pipe. The cub, curious about the echoing sounds inside the pipe, stuck its head into the opening. The morning runoff from the hills had filled the pipe halfway, creating a swift current that tugged at the cub's fur. "Hey, watch this," Ethan said, standing up. He grabbed a handful of pebbles, aiming at the cub's exposed backside. The first stone bounced off the cub's back. It yelped in surprise and tried to back out of the pipe, but the slippery metal walls gave no purchase. Ethan laughed and tossed another stone, this one hitting harder. "Stop it, man," Jacob said weakly, though he didn't move to interfere. The cub panicked. Its paws scraped desperately against the pipe walls as it lost footing on the wet moss inside. The current pulled stronger, and in seconds the small creature was sucked into the drainage system. "Ethan!" Jacob shouted, jumping up. "What?" Ethan shrugged, already losing interest. "It's just a bear." From inside the cottage, Isabelle's head snapped toward the window. Her small ears had caught something else, a faint, terrified squealing coming from somewhere outside. The sound wasn't like birds or squirrels. This was different. Desperate. "Ma," Isabelle whimpered, her blue eyes wide. Avery finally looked up from the counter. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" But Isabelle was already squirming to get down, her little legs kicking. The crying, that's what it was, distinct and heart-wrenching, pulled at something deep inside her. She'd never heard such sounds before, but somehow understood their meaning perfectly. The drainage pipe, which stretched underground for nearly half a mile before emptying into a larger stream, carried the cub's terrified cries like a speaker system. The sound echoed off the metal walls, distorting into something even more heartbreaking. On the bridge, the 3 boys froze. They could hear it too now, that awful raw sound of pure fear. "Should we?" Logan started, then fell silent. "It'll find its way out," Ethan said, though his cocky grin had disappeared. But deep inside the drain pipe, trapped between rushing water and slippery walls, the cub was failing. Its tiny legs thrashed uselessly as the current carried it deeper into darkness. Each yelp for its mother grew weaker. Back in the cottage, Isabelle had managed to slide down from her mother's arms. She toddled toward the front door with determination unusual for her age. Her small hands reached for the doorknob, still too high, but she didn't give up. Avery watched, puzzled. "Isabelle, where are you going, baby?" The cries from the drainage pipe continued, now joined by another sound: heavy footsteps crashing through underbrush. The mother bear had heard her cub's distress calls and was racing toward the village, following the fading echoes through the woods. Isabelle pressed her forehead against the door, those same cries that terrified the teenagers somehow calling to her with urgency. She opened her mouth and let out a wail of her own, her version of an answer to the trapped cub's pleas. The adults in the village, busy with their morning routines, remained unaware of the drama unfolding. The mother bear burst from the tree line behind the cottage, her powerful nose following her cub's scent to the drainage pipe's entrance. She arrived just as Isabelle finally managed to open the cottage door. For one frozen moment, woman, baby, and bear faced each other across the small garden. Avery dropped her coffee mug with a crash, instinctively reaching for Isabelle, but the baby didn't run toward her mother. Instead, Isabelle pointed directly at the drainage pipe, her small face scrunched in distress. "Ba-ba!" she cried, the closest thing to bear her young mouth could form. The mother bear, instead of charging as Avery expected, followed the baby's gesture. She approached the pipe entrance, her massive head turning as she tried to locate her cub's voice, now barely audible from deep within the drainage system. On the bridge, Ethan grabbed his friend's arms. "We need to get out of here, now." "But the cub," Jacob protested. "Forget the cub." As they started to run, Isabelle's cries grew louder, competing with the bear's anxious growls. The 18-month-old had somehow understood what the older boys couldn't, that crying together might reach the trapped cub. Inside the drainage pipe, the cub's strength was nearly gone. The cold water numbed its limbs and the complete darkness disoriented its senses. It could barely hear its mother's roars filtering through the pipe walls. And now, something else. A higher-pitched sound, almost musical in its rhythm. Isabelle's continued wailing created an echo that traveled through the pipe system with surprising clarity. The cub's ears perked up at this new sound. Not threatening like the teenagers, not desperate like its mother, but somehow comforting. With what little energy remained, the cub lifted its head and gave one more cry. Section 2. The sound that came out of Isabelle's mouth next was unlike anything anyone had ever heard from a toddler. It wasn't quite a word, wasn't quite a song, but something in between. A haunting melody that seemed to reach through the earth itself. Her small hands pressed against her mouth as if trying to direct this strange new sound toward the drainage pipe. Avery stood paralyzed in the doorway, watching her daughter make noises she didn't know a baby could produce. The mother bear stopped her frantic pacing and tilted her massive head, drawn to the unexpected harmony between child and cub beneath the ground. Inside the drainage pipe, the cub's nose twitched. The musical vibration of Isabelle's call somehow felt different from everything else. It carried warmth, even in the cold metal confines. The half-drowned creature managed to lift one paw, scraping weakly against the pipe wall in response. The sound rippled outward through the village. Old Mrs. Thompson paused in hanging her laundry, her weathered hands gripping the clothesline as she tried to identify the source. Mr. Phillips stopped chopping firewood, his axe frozen mid-swing. Even the village dogs fell silent, their ears perked toward that strange melody. 3 houses down, Jessica Brooks was feeding her cat when she heard it. She rushed to her window, peering through the morning fog toward the Carter cottage. What she saw made her gasp. A massive bear mere feet from little Isabelle, while the child stood completely unafraid, making sounds that belonged in some ancient forest ritual. Back at the drainage pipe, something extraordinary began to happen. The mother bear lowered her enormous head until her nose was just inches from Isabelle's face. The baby didn't flinch. Instead, she reached out one tiny hand and touched the bear's wet black nose. The bear's hot breath fogged around Isabelle's face, but the child only blinked slowly, still humming that otherworldly tune. Avery's heart hammered against her ribs. Every maternal instinct screamed at her to grab Isabelle and run, but something kept her rooted in place. There was communication happening here that she couldn't understand, between her daughter, a wild bear, and a cub trapped somewhere in the darkness below. The teenagers, having reached the safety of the village square, heard the commotion. Ethan felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead. The sounds from the cottage weren't screams of terror. They were something else entirely. Something he'd caused, and something he suddenly couldn't ignore. "We should go back," Jacob said, his voice trembling. "Are you crazy?" Logan hissed, but Ethan was already turning around. His earlier bravado dissolved into churning guilt. They'd caused this. That baby was in danger because of what they'd done. As they crept back toward the cottage, taking a hidden path behind the gardens, they saw other villagers emerging from their homes. The unusual sounds had drawn them out like a mysterious siren song. Some clutched their robes tighter against the morning chill. Others whispered prayers or grabbed their phones to call for help. Isabelle's musical humming grew stronger, resonating with a frequency that seemed to make the very ground vibrate. Small pebbles near the drainage pipe began to shift and dance. The mother bear raised her head and let out a long, low moan that harmonized perfectly with the child's song. Deep underground, the trapped cub felt something shift. The vibrations from above were doing something strange to the water flow in the pipe. Debris that had been blocking the passage ahead started to loosen, dislodged by the resonance. The current, which had been threatening to drown the cub, suddenly had a new direction to flow. Avery finally found her courage and stepped toward the bridge between her species and the bear. She moved slowly, recognizing on some primal level that interrupting this communication could be disastrous. As she approached, she noticed tears streaming down her own cheeks. When had she started crying? "Please," she whispered to the bear, though she didn't know what she was asking for. The bear turned her dark eyes to Avery, and for a moment Mother looked at Mother. An understanding passed between them that transcended language. They both had babies. They were both terrified. Isabelle suddenly stopped humming and instead began to make sharp, distinct clicks with her tongue, a sound so precise it echoed like sonar through the drainage system. Each click bounced off the pipe walls with perfect clarity, painting a sound picture of the trapped cub's location. Ethan and his friends, now hidden behind the Thompsons' hedge, watched in disbelief. The baby was somehow mapping the drainage system with nothing but sounds from her mouth. It was impossible, yet they were witnessing it. "Look at the pipe," Jacob breathed. At the drainage entrance, water was beginning to bubble more vigorously. The clicks were creating pressure changes that were actually affecting the water flow. Isabelle intensified her rhythm, and suddenly, impossibly, water began to flow backward through the pipe. Not massively, but enough to give the struggling cub a moment of air. The mother bear seemed to understand this phenomenon better than any human watching. She pressed her massive body against the ground, adding her own weight to create additional pressure shifts. The earth itself began to cooperate with their efforts. Village elder Sarah Mitchell arrived on the scene, drawn by the reports of others. She'd lived in Willowbrook for 73 years and thought she'd seen everything. But watching an 18-month-old child command water and earth with pure sound, while a wild bear acted as willing participant, shattered everything she thought possible. "Call Fire Chief Daniel," she commanded someone nearby. "And someone get my husband. He'll want to document this." Inside the drainage pipe, the cub felt the water pressure change dramatically. The clicks created pockets of air that allowed it to breathe more easily. With newfound strength, it began to crawl forward rather than fighting the current backward. The resonance had cleared a path, and instinctively, the cub followed the sound. Isabelle's clicking grew faster, more urgent. Her small body swayed with the rhythm as if conducting an invisible orchestra. The mother bear began to dig at the ground near the pipe entrance, her powerful claws tearing through soil and rock. The combined efforts, sound, pressure, and physical intervention, were creating a rescue attempt that defied natural law. Avery knelt beside her daughter, finally close enough to see the child's face. Isabelle's eyes weren't focused on anything visible. They gazed somewhere far beyond, as if seeing through the earth itself. Drool escaped her tiny mouth as she concentrated harder than ever before, but she didn't let up on the clicks. The father, Michael Carter, burst through the garden gate after receiving frantic calls from neighbors about a bear at their cottage. He froze at the sight, his wife kneeling by their baby, who was making impossible sounds while a massive grizzly worked the earth beside them. "Don't move," Avery said quietly, without turning. "Isabelle's trying to save the bear's cub." Michael's journalist mind kicked in despite his terror. He slowly raised his phone and began recording, capturing footage that would later become viral around the world. But in that moment, he only thought of protecting his family while documenting the miraculous. The clicking suddenly changed pattern. Isabelle's method shifted to long, sustained whistles that seemed to come from somewhere deep in her tiny chest. The mother bear responded immediately, stepping back from the pipe entrance. She turned her head to the side, listening intently to something underground. "She can hear it moving," whispered Sarah Mitchell, who had crept closer. "The whistles are guiding the cub through the pipe system." Indeed, the sustained frequencies were creating a sound tunnel through the drainage system. The cub, exhausted but determined, was crawling toward the promise of these vibrations. The whistles grew stronger as the cub drew closer to the entrance. Ethan stepped out from behind the hedge, unable to hide anymore. His friends followed reluctantly. The guilt had become unbearable, and witnessing this miracle made him feel obligated to confess. "We did this," he called out, his voice breaking. "We pushed the cub in, we're sorry." The confession hung in the morning air. Several villagers turned to stare at the teenagers, recognition dawning. But before anyone could respond, Isabelle's whistling reached a crescendo that made everyone cover their ears. The drainage pipe shuddered. Something dark appeared at the entrance, a small waterlogged nose followed by matted fur. The mother bear rushed forward, her powerful jaws gentle as she grasped her cub by the scruff of its neck. Isabelle immediately stopped whistling and collapsed into her mother's arms, exhausted as if she'd run a marathon. The sudden silence felt deafening after the sustained sounds. The mother bear carefully placed her cub on solid ground. It was alive but barely conscious, its small chest rising and falling rapidly. She began licking it vigorously, working to warm its waterlogged body and restore circulation. The entire village held its breath as they watched the reunion. Some had tears in their eyes, others filmed with shaking hands. The three teenagers stood apart from the crowd, their earlier bravado replaced with shame and wonder. As the cub slowly regained consciousness and let out a weak mew, Isabelle stirred in Avery's arms. The child reached out one hand toward the bear family, her little fingers trembling with residual vibrations from her extraordinary effort. The mother bear looked at Isabelle one final time. In that gaze was gratitude, understanding, and perhaps something more, a recognition that crossed species boundaries. She lowered her head in what seemed unmistakably like a nod of thanks before turning to guide her weakened cub back toward the forest. But as they began to move away, the cub turned back, its fur now standing on end. It stared directly at Ethan, and for a moment, the teenager felt those amber eyes burning into his soul, a mixture of accusation and the remnant of terror. The guilt intensified, threatening to crush him. "Wait," Isabelle suddenly spoke, her first word after the ordeal, startling everyone, but as quickly as she'd regained consciousness, her eyes rolled back, and she went limp in Avery's arms. "Isabelle!" Avery cried, checking for a pulse. The child was breathing but completely unresponsive, as if the effort had drained every ounce of energy from her tiny body. Michael rushed over, his journalistic training shifting to fatherly panic. "We need to get her to the medical center now." As they carried Isabelle toward their car, strange murmurs began spreading through the crowd. Some claimed they saw a golden glow around the child's body as she'd performed her miracle. Others swore the very air had vibrated with ancient energy. Sarah Mitchell stood silent, her mind racing with memories of stories her grandmother used to tell. Tales of humans born with the ability to speak to nature itself. The mother bear paused at the forest's edge, her cub leaning heavily against her leg. She turned once more to look at the cottage, at the place where a human child had saved her own with powers that shouldn't exist. A long, mournful call echoed through the morning, not a threat, but a promise, or perhaps a warning to the village that something had fundamentally changed this day. As the bears disappeared into the tree line, Fire Chief Daniel arrived with his truck, having heard the emergency call about the bear situation. He stopped short when he saw his neighbors standing in reverent silence, some clutching phones that recorded the impossible. "What happened here?" he demanded, looking between the dazed faces. "A miracle," Sarah Mitchell said simply. A human child and a bear spoke the same language. The three teenagers shifted uncomfortably. Soon they would face consequences for their actions, but something more profound weighed on them. Ethan, in particular, felt changed at a cellular level. He'd set these events in motion through thoughtless cruelty, and watched a baby undo his wrong with mysterious powers that challenged everything he thought he knew about the world. Meanwhile, at the village medical center, Dr. James Sullivan examined Isabelle with growing confusion. All her vital signs were normal, except for unusual energy readings on the EKG, patterns he'd never encountered that resembled both brainwaves and seismic activity. "Has she ever shown any abilities before?" he asked Michael and Avery. They shook their heads. Their daughter had been perfectly normal, walking late if anything, speaking very few words, a happy but unremarkable toddler. Nothing had prepared them for this morning's events. Isabelle remained unconscious for 3 hours. When she finally opened her eyes, the first thing she did was point out the window and say "Ba-ba," her word for bear. Her parents exchanged worried glances. Had she retained some connection? Some lingering bond with the creatures she'd saved? News of the incident spread quickly despite attempts to keep it quiet. By evening, the Carter cottage was surrounded by news vans and curious onlookers from neighboring towns. Videos taken by villagers had already begun circulating online, though many dismissed them as clever fakes. But in Willowbrook, no one could dismiss what they'd witnessed. The drainage pipe stood as a monument to the morning's events, with small offerings appearing around it. Flowers, stones, even children's drawings of bears and babies. As night fell, something else began happening that would link these events to an even deeper mystery. Several villagers reported hearing distant animal calls in patterns similar to Isabelle's clicks and whistles. Pack animals, Wolves, coyotes, even domestic dogs seemed to be practicing the sounds they'd heard that morning. Ethan couldn't sleep. He paced his room, replaying the day's events. His parents had grounded him indefinitely after he'd confessed, but the punishment felt inadequate for what he'd done. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the amber eyes of the cub staring at him with betrayed terror. Around midnight, a knock came at his window. Jacob and Logan stood outside, looking pale in the moonlight. "We need to do something," Jacob said, "to make this right." "How?" Ethan asked. "How do we make this right?" Logan held up his phone, showing a news article. "People are saying the cub might come back, that babies saved from drowning sometimes return to thank their rescuers." It was superstition, folklore, but they clung to it anyway. The three of them made a pact that night. If they ever saw the cub again, they would protect it with their lives. It was a small promise, but it was all they could offer. Back at the Carter cottage, Isabelle slept deeply, occasionally murmuring sounds that resembled her morning symphony. Avery and Michael took turns watching over her, neither quite believing what they'd witnessed, both terrified it might happen again. In the forest, the mother bear nursed her cub back to full strength. She knew, with ancestral wisdom passed down through generations, that the human child had altered the natural order. Such gifts came with prices, debts that would need to be repaid. And in her mind's eye, she could almost see the threads of fate being rewoven around that small village. The next morning brought 3 more mysteries that would deepen the Carter family's connection to the bear incident. And eventually, everything would lead to a shocking revelation about Isabelle's ancestry that no one in the village could have predicted. The first mystery arrived before dawn, when Michael Carter was awakened by the sound of scratching at their bedroom window. Through the glass, he saw dozens of fireflies arranged in a perfect spiral pattern, their golden lights pulsing in the exact rhythm Isabelle had used to save the cub. The phenomenon lasted only 20 seconds before the insects dispersed, leaving him questioning whether he'd dreamed it. He didn't mention it to Avery, who was still sleeping fitfully beside their daughter's makeshift bed. Isabelle had refused to sleep in her own room after the incident, and Avery couldn't bear to have her out of sight anyway. The toddler's breathing was normal, but her small hands occasionally twitched as if conducting an invisible orchestra. At 6:17 a.m., the second mystery unfolded. Every electronic device in the Carter household suddenly tuned to the same frequency. Radios, televisions, phones, even Michael's digital camera. Static gave way to a rhythmic clicking sound that perfectly matched Isabelle's rescue pattern from the day before. The phenomenon struck fear into Avery, who frantically tried to turn everything off, but the sounds continued until Isabelle stirred and opened her eyes. Only then did the electronics return to normal. "Dada birds?" Isabelle asked, sitting up and looking around the room with unusual alertness. The third mystery was the most disturbing. At 8:30 a.m., as Michael prepared to leave for the village meeting about the previous day's events, he found every house key in Willowbrook had been moved overnight. Not stolen, but rearranged. Each family's keys had been placed in patterns that reminded villagers of Isabelle's sonic mapping of the drainage system. Some keys formed perfect circles, others geometric shapes that defied random placement. Old Mrs. Thompson's keys had been arranged to spell "listen" on her doorstep. Fire Chief Daniels formed an arrow pointing to the Carter cottage. 3 houses down, Jessica Brooks found her keys arranged in what looked unmistakably like a bare paw print. The village meeting descended into chaos as theories ranged from practical jokes to supernatural intervention. But everyone fell silent when Sarah Mitchell stood up, her voice carrying the weight of her 73 years. "My grandmother spoke of something called the echo touched," she said, her weathered hands gripping the podium. children born under specific celestial alignments who carry the voices of the wild within them. She said they appear once every century when nature needs them most. Parents exchanged nervous glances. Some had heard similar tales but dismissed them as old wives' tales. Now, with fireflies dancing in code and keys forming messages, those stories felt less like folklore and more like forgotten warnings. Isabelle herself seemed different when she woke fully that morning. The child who had struggled with even basic words now pointed at objects and spoke their names with perfect clarity: window, tree, bird, though she'd never said them before. Her eyes, always a striking blue, now seemed to shift colors in certain light, displaying flecks of amber that hadn't been there yesterday. Dr. James Sullivan arrived at the Carter home with specialized equipment, claiming he wanted to run routine tests on Isabelle. The truth was more concerning. He'd stayed up all night researching her unusual EKG readings, discovering they matched patterns found only in studies of deep-sea creatures capable of echolocation and certain cave-dwelling mammals. As he set up his instruments, Isabelle watched him with an unnerving intensity. When he placed the stethoscope on her chest, she giggled and said, "Thunder hearts," before the doctor could hear for himself that her heartbeat contained irregular patterns that sounded exactly like distant thunder. Outside, news crews had multiplied overnight. Among them stood Dr. Elena Reeves, a professor of bioacoustics from the nearby university. She'd been studying animal communication for 20 years and had never encountered anything close to what the videos from Willowbrook showed. She set up her own recording equipment, hoping to capture even residual sounds from Isabelle's phenomenon. The 3 teenagers who had caused the initial incident became unlikely celebrities. Other teens gathered around them, some seeking details, others casting judgment. Ethan found himself isolated even among his friends, the memory of the cub's terrified eyes haunting him more than the social consequences. Around noon, the forest delivered another enigma. Rangers reported finding a massive tree at the edge of the woods, an ancient oak that had stood for generations, now bearing carvings that hadn't been there the day before. The markings resembled musical notes, but predated any known notation system, seeming to chart the exact frequencies Isabelle had used. Michael, acting on journalistic instinct, visited the tree with his camera. As he photographed the carvings, his equipment picked up subsonic frequencies emanating from the wood itself. When he touched the bark, he felt vibrations that made his skin tingle, and for just a moment, he heard what sounded like distant whispers in a language he couldn't identify. Back home, Avery noticed something troubling. Isabelle had begun speaking to empty corners of the room, using a mixture of her new clarity and the strange clicking sounds. The toddler would gesture and nod as if receiving responses, then relay information with disturbing accuracy. "Yellow sweater lost under the kitchen table," Isabelle announced, pointing to a corner where nothing was visible. Sure enough, when Avery looked under the table, she found an old yellow sweater she'd misplaced weeks ago. The discovery should have been amusing, but instead left her deeply unsettled. That afternoon, Isabelle's abilities manifested in a way that finally convinced the last skeptics. During Dr. Sullivan's examination, a violent storm rolled in without warning. Meteorologists later called it the most sudden system on record. Torrential rain threatened to flood the lower parts of the village, including the area where the medical center's emergency generators were housed. Isabelle suddenly sat up on the examination table, her small face contorting with concentration. She began producing a series of sounds that combined clicks, whistles, and something that resembled radio static. Within minutes, the rain pattern changed. Instead of the dangerous deluge that had been falling, precipitation became a gentle, steady shower that satisfied gardens without overwhelming drainage systems. Weather Service radar captured the impossible, a storm system that reorganized itself around Willowbrook, leaving surrounding areas to continue experiencing the downpour while their small village received exactly what it needed. News of this weather manipulation spread rapidly. Religious leaders interpreted it as divine intervention. Scientists demanded explanations that violated known laws of physics. Government agencies began taking interest in what they cautiously termed the Willowbrook anomaly. Isabelle's parents found themselves under increasing pressure as media attention intensified. Television trucks lined their street. Helicopter news crews circled overhead. The family that had sought a quiet life in a small village suddenly stood at the center of what some were calling the most significant developmental phenomenon of the century. Amid this chaos, Isabelle dropped a bombshell that would reshape their understanding of everything. "Grandma Bear comes tonight," she announced during dinner, using a clear, full sentence that stunned her parents into silence. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" Avery asked, though part of her already feared the answer. She has questions about before. The cryptic statement proved prophetic. At precisely midnight, a visit did occur, but not from whom anyone expected. Instead of bears, an elderly woman arrived at their door, someone none of them had seen before, speaking with an accent that none could place. She wore clothing that seemed simultaneously ancient and timeless, and carried a staff adorned with carved animals. Her eyes, when she looked at Isabelle, held the same amber quality the child had recently developed. "Your daughter," she said to Michael and Avery, "descends from a line thought extinct. The old gifts have awakened because the world needs them again." Before they could respond, the stranger continued, "3 choices will be offered to your family. Each path leads to a different future, not just for Isabelle, but for the delicate balance between human and wild." She raised her staff, and the carved animals seemed to move in the dim porch light. Isabelle, who had been watching from the window, pressed her palm against the glass. Where her hand touched, the window began to sing with a frequency that made the stranger smile. "The first choice comes with tomorrow's dawn," the woman said, "when you must decide whether to hide her gift or share it with the world." She turned to leave, but paused. "One more thing. The boys who set these events in motion have a role yet to play. Destiny rarely offers second chances, but when it does, the price of refusing is steep." As she disappeared into the darkness, Avery noticed something that chilled her to the bone. The woman left no footprints in the soft earth, but Isabelle's small hands had left glowing imprints on the window that slowly faded like dying embers. Michael immediately called village security, though he suspected they'd find no trace of the mysterious visitor. While he made his report, Avery sat with Isabelle, who had suddenly become very animated. "Ba dreams soon," Isabelle announced, pointing to her own forehead. "Big Ba has secret." "What secret, baby?" Avery asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know. Isabelle looked at her mother with eyes far too knowing for a child her age. "Why you here? Why Dada camera here? Why village has forgotten voice? Big Ba remembers everything." The statement sent shivers down Avery's spine. They had moved to Willowbrook 3 years ago, finding the cottage through what had seemed like serendipity. The previous owners had left suddenly, practically giving the property away. Now she wondered if their arrival had been part of something larger, something orchestrated by forces they couldn't begin to understand. That night, neither parent slept. They took turns watching Isabelle, who slumbered peacefully despite the storms of change swirling around her. At 3 a.m., both simultaneously received alerts on their phones. Emergency broadcasts reporting unusual animal migrations unprecedented for the season. Bears were moving from their normal territories. following routes that seemed to converge on central locations. Wildlife experts were baffled. At 4:30 a.m., Isabelle stirred and spoke in her sleep, her voice carrying the resonance that had echoed through pipes just yesterday. 3 suns will show 3 paths. Choose with heart that hears all voices. The phrase repeated 3 times before the child settled back into deeper sleep. Avery recorded it on her phone, though she knew she'd never forget the exact words or their unsettling musical tone. Dawn brought not sunlight, but 3 distinct phenomena in the sky that defied meteorological explanation. First, a traditional sunrise appeared in the east. Second, what scientists would later call atmospheric distortion, created the illusion of a sun in the western sky. Third, directly overhead, storm clouds parted to reveal a perfect circle of clear sky where the sun seemed to shine unnaturally bright. Willowbrook residents gathered in the streets, pointing at their sky's impossibility. The 3 different light sources cast multiple shadows, creating an otherworldly landscape where even familiar streets looked alien. Photographers and climatologists arrived in droves, none able to explain the simultaneous sunrise, sunset, and zenith phenomenon. Isabelle woke to this surreal morning with unusual energy. She bounded downstairs and immediately ran to the window facing the forest. Standing on her tiptoes, she pressed both palms against the glass and began humming. The sound built to frequencies that made windows throughout the cottage vibrate in harmony. Outside, animals began emerging from the woods, not threateningly, but purposefully. Deer, rabbits, raccoons, birds, and even insects gathered in the Carter's garden, forming concentric circles around the house. The most startling participant arrived last. The mother bear from yesterday's incident stepped out from behind the hedge, her cub healthy and strong by her side. The young bear's fur had changed. Where once it had been solid brown, now it displayed patches of golden fur and patterns that seemed to shift when observed directly. Isabelle's humming reached a crescendo as the amber-eyed cub lifted its head and responded with sounds that perfectly mimicked the child's tones. Mother and child, bear and human, began a duet that harmonized with each of the 3 suns above. This was the moment Dr. Elena Reeves had been hoping to capture. Her equipment recorded frequencies that theoretically shouldn't be produced by human vocal cords. The data stream showed communication patterns more complex than whale songs, with information density exceeding anything achieved by human language. "It's not just communication," Dr. Reeves whispered into her recording device. "It's information transfer at a quantum level. If confirmed, this could revolutionize our understanding of consciousness itself." As the duet continued, other villagers noticed their own pets behaving strangely. Dogs howled in harmony. Cats purring created counter-melodies. Even the village canaries in their cages joined the symphony. It was as if Isabelle and the bear cub had unlocked a sonic key that connected all living things. The 3 teenagers watched from different vantage points. Ethan stood in his backyard, transfixed by guilt and wonder. The cub occasionally looked his way, and he felt those amber eyes measuring him, waiting for something. Jacob hid behind trees, fascinated but afraid. Logan stood openly with other onlookers, attempting to film everything on his phone. Inside the cottage, Michael and Avery faced an impossible decision. Government representatives had arrived, offering protection and resources if Isabelle became part of a special research program. Media moguls proposed exclusive rights to her story for astronomical sums. Both academic institutions and spiritual organizations claimed they could best serve her unique abilities. The mysterious woman's words echoed, "The first choice comes with tomorrow's dawn, when you must decide whether to hide her gift or share it with the world." As the supernatural duet between child and cub continued outside, Three very different paths crystallized before them. Each promised safety in different forms: physical, financial, or spiritual. Each also demanded sacrifice. But none addressed the terrifying question that kept them paralyzed. What if the right choice wasn't about protecting Isabelle at all, but about protecting the world from what she might become? The three suns above seemed to pulse with each note of the duet, as if reality itself was holding its breath for their decision. In the garden, animals waited with otherworldly patience. And deep in the forest, something ancient stirred. Something that had been sleeping for generations, awakened by the song of a gifted child and a grateful bear. The bears that emerged from the shadows weren't just any bears. 7 massive grizzlies, each bearing similar golden patches to the cub, formed a semicircle behind the mother and child. Their presence shifted the atmosphere from miraculous to potentially terrifying. These weren't random forest inhabitants. They moved with purpose, with hierarchy, with a consciousness that made even the bravest villagers step back nervously. Isabelle stopped humming abruptly and turned to her parents with eyes that now definitely held amber flecks. "They came for Teacher Mama," she said, pointing to the largest bear. "Old stories need new voice." The massive grizzly, easily 9 feet tall when it briefly rose on hind legs, regarded Isabelle with an intelligence that made Michael's journalist skepticism crumble completely. In that moment, watching his toddler communicate with what could only be described as a bear elder, he knew they no longer lived in the world he thought he understood. The choice he and Avery had to make wasn't just about their daughter anymore. It was about participating in something that would redefine the relationship between human and nature. As the three suns reached their zenith, casting triple shadows across Willowbrook, the first of many decisions that would shape their future demanded an answer. But before they could speak, Isabelle dropped one final bombshell that morning. She turned from the bears and walked calmly to where the 3 teenagers had been watching. Looking directly at Ethan, she extended her small hand and said words that would haunt him. "Your promise is heard. When the time comes, 3 must become one to save what was hurt. The cub remembers, and so will you." The cryptic prophecy hung in the air as Isabelle returned to her parents, leaving everyone to wonder what price would be demanded for the miracle they'd all witnessed. The duet had ended, but its echoes would resonate through the village for days to come. And somewhere in the forest, something very old smiled a very human smile, satisfied that the ancient wheel had finally begun to turn again. For 3 days following the appearance of the 3 suns, Willowbrook existed in a state of suspended reality. The skies had returned to normal shortly after Isabelle's duet with the bear cub, but nothing else about the village felt ordinary. Scientists, journalists, and government officials flooded the small town, transforming it from a peaceful haven into a circus of competing interests. The Carter family retreated into their cottage, drawing curtains against the constant flash of cameras. Local police established a perimeter around the property after 2 incidents where researchers attempted to collect Isabelle's DNA from discarded items in their garbage. Chief Daniel stationed 2 officers permanently at the end of their driveway, though even he couldn't hide his unease around Isabelle now. Inside the cottage, Isabelle's transformation continued at an alarming pace. Not just her speech, which now flowed with the vocabulary of a child twice her age, but physical changes that couldn't be explained away. Her eyes had completely shifted to a mesmerizing amber gold, identical to the bear cub's gaze. When she sang to herself at night, her voice carried harmonics impossible for human vocal cords. Most disturbing of all, plants around her grew at accelerated rates, houseplants stretching toward her as if she were the sun itself. Michael found himself documenting everything in a journal that quickly filled with observations, theories, and drawings. Being a journalist, he couldn't help analyzing the situation even as it terrified him. Avery, meanwhile, spent hours researching obscure folklore about children with special connections to nature. She'd found references to forest children in myths spanning cultures from Siberia to the Americas, but nothing that exactly matched Isabelle's abilities. "What if she's not the first?" Avery whispered to Michael on the fourth night, as they watched Isabelle sleeping peacefully. What if there were others throughout history but the world wasn't ready to understand? "Or what if she's the first of something new?" Michael responded, his voice tight with worry. Evolution doesn't always give warnings. Their conversation was interrupted by a mysterious text message sent simultaneously to both their phones. It contained only geographic coordinates and one line: "When ready, come without devices. She will know the way." The coordinates pointed to a location deep in the forest, at least 15 miles from the village. Michael immediately suspected a trap, perhaps laid by overzealous researchers or even government agencies interested in Isabelle's abilities. Avery felt something different, a resonance with the strange woman who had visited their porch days earlier. "We should go," she said firmly. "Whatever's happening to Isabelle, I don't think modern science has the answers." Michael began to argue, but stopped when he noticed Isabelle sitting up in bed, her eyes open and alert despite having appeared deeply asleep moments before. "The old bears wait," she said simply. "Time for stories that were forgotten." Her certainty settled something in both parents. Whatever was happening to their daughter connected to something ancient, something that predated their understanding of the world. Modern institutions, with their tests and theories, might never grasp the full truth. They made plans in whispers. They would leave before dawn, using the back trails through the forest rather than the main road where media camped. They told no one, not even the police officers stationed outside. This journey felt sacred somehow, meant only for the three of them. As they prepared small backpacks with essentials, Ethan Marshall watched their cottage from his bedroom window across the village. He hadn't slept properly since Isabelle's cryptic words to him. The phrase, "three must become one," haunted his dreams, along with images of drowning bear cubs and amber eyes judging his soul. He'd texted his friends multiple times, but Jacob and Logan had distanced themselves, frightened by the supernatural events and eager to escape association with the initial cruelty that had started everything. Around midnight, Ethan noticed unusual shadows moving around the Carter cottage. At first, he thought it might be more journalists trying to get photographs, but these figures moved differently, low to the ground, fluid, purposeful. With a chill, he realized they were animals, dozens of them, moving in coordinated patterns around the house like sentries. He grabbed his binoculars for a closer look and nearly dropped them when he recognized foxes, raccoons, even what appeared to be a family of skunks, all patrolling in shifting formations. At the edge of the forest, barely visible in the moonlight, stood larger shadows that could only be the bears. Driven by an impulse he couldn't explain, Ethan dressed quickly and slipped out his window. Something told him the Carters were planning to leave, and Isabelle's words about a promise echoed in his mind. He'd made no conscious vow, but the guilt that consumed him since pushing the cub into the pipe felt like an unspoken commitment waiting to be fulfilled. As he crept through sleeping backyards toward the cottage, a fox intercepted him. Instead of running away, it sat directly in his path, watching with unnerving intelligence. After a moment, it turned and trotted a few paces before looking back expectantly. "You want me to follow you," Ethan whispered, feeling ridiculous talking to a wild animal yet somehow certain of the communication happening. The fox led him not to the front of the cottage where police watched, but to a small window at the back. Inside, he could see the Carter family packing small bags. Isabelle suddenly paused and turned directly toward the window, her amber eyes finding him immediately in the darkness. Instead of alerting her parents, she simply nodded once, as if his presence was expected, perhaps even necessary. Ethan ducked down, heart pounding. He'd come with no plan beyond observation, but now felt swept into something larger than himself. The fox nudged his leg, then slipped away toward the forest edge. Ethan hesitated only briefly before following. If the Carters were leaving tonight, he would need to know which way they went. Not to report them, though multiple journalists had offered him money for insider information, but because some instinct told him his redemption somehow connected to whatever journey they were undertaking. In the pre-dawn hours, the Carter family slipped from their home through a rear garden gate. The animal sentries parted to let them pass, then reformed ranks behind them, effectively covering their tracks. Isabelle walked with confidence unusual for a toddler, occasionally stopping to touch certain trees or plants as if greeting old friends. Ethan followed at a distance, guided by the fox that seemed determined to keep him involved yet hidden from the family. The strange procession moved deeper into the forest along game trails that gradually widened into what appeared to be ancient paths, unused by humans for perhaps centuries. Miles into the journey, when sunrise should have brightened the forest, a strange phenomenon occurred. The canopy above thickened impossibly, the trees actually growing and intertwining overhead to create a green tunnel that blocked normal daylight. Instead, a luminescence came from the plants themselves. Subtle, glowing lichens, mushrooms with bioluminescent caps, and flowers that seemed to capture light and redirect it downward. Isabelle laughed in delight at this magical illumination, running ahead of her parents who struggled to keep pace. The forest had transformed into something from a fairy tale, beautiful but distinctly otherworldly, operating under different natural laws than the world they knew. "Michael," Avery whispered, gripping her husband's hand tightly, "do you think we're still in our world?" The question wasn't as absurd as it might have sounded days ago. The forest around them contained plants neither could identify, insects with too many wings, birds whose songs contained distinct words if you listened carefully. Reality seemed to be shifting the deeper they traveled. "I think boundaries are thinner here," Michael replied, carefully choosing his words. "Not a different world, maybe, but a place where worlds overlap." Isabelle stopped suddenly, turning to her parents with unusual solemnity. "The old bears live between," she explained. "Not here and not there. Special place for special voices." Before they could question what she meant, the path widened into a massive clearing, unlike anything that should have existed in this forest. Ancient stones formed a perfect circle around a central space where the trees had been hollowed into natural structures resembling a village square. Symbols carved into tree trunks and stone markers resembled the patterns Isabelle had produced during her sonic duet with the cub. Most remarkable were the inhabitants. Bears of every species, not just the grizzlies they'd seen near their cottage, but black bears, polar bears, spectacled bears from South America, sun bears from Asia, and species Michael recognized from extinct classification charts. All moved with the same heightened intelligence they'd witnessed in the mother and cub, and all bore patches of golden fur that shifted and glimmered as they moved. In the center stood the elderly woman who had visited their porch, now dressed in ceremonial garments adorned with bear claws and amber beads. Beside her, on a throne-like seat crafted from a single massive stump, sat the largest bear any of them had ever seen, at least 12 feet tall when it rose to greet them. Its fur was almost entirely gold, with only tiny patches of brown remaining, and its eyes held a wisdom and awareness that felt older than humanity itself. "Welcome to the Council of Voices," the woman said. her accent shifting subtly with each word, as if she spoke multiple languages simultaneously. Few humans have ever been permitted to witness this gathering. Isabelle broke away from her parents and ran directly to the massive golden bear, showing no fear whatsoever. The great creature lowered its head, touching its nose gently to her forehead in what could only be described as a blessing. "The child remembers what you have forgotten," the woman continued, addressing Michael and Avery. "Just as the bears remember what humans choose to forget. Today, those memories will be shared, and choices made that will determine far more than just your daughter's future." From his hiding place at the edge of the clearing, Ethan watched in awe. The fox that had guided him now sat beside him calmly, as if they were both invited observers to this impossible gathering. Part of him wanted to run, to return to the rational world where bears were just animals and children didn't communicate with nature itself. But Isabelle's prophecy kept him rooted in place. 3 must become 1 to save what was hurt. The assembled bears suddenly began to harmonize with sounds similar to Isabelle's clicks and whistles. The vibrations resonated through the clearing with such power that the very air seemed to shimmer. As the frequency intensified, something extraordinary happened. The space between the ancient stones flickered and wavered like heat mirages, revealing glimpses of other times and places. Michael, the journalist who prided himself on rational observation, found himself wordless before visions of ancient human tribes living in harmony with bears, sharing territories and knowledge. Then came darker imagery: hunts, traps, deliberate exterminations, habitat destruction, climate shifts. The history of the complex relationship between bears and humans played out in these dimensional windows, spanning thousands of years. Avery saw something different. Generations of children with amber eyes appearing throughout human history. Some were celebrated as shamans and healers. Others were feared, hidden away, even sacrificed by their own communities. She watched a medieval child with Isabelle's abilities burned as a witch while bears raged helplessly at the edge of a village. She saw another in ancient China, honored as an imperial advisor, teaching emperors to listen to the wisdom of nature. The flashing visions culminated in a scene from recent history, a laboratory filled with children displaying varying degrees of the amber-eyed trait, subjected to tests and experiments. The date stamp on the vision read 1982, and the facility bore the logo of a government research division that Avery recognized with horror. Her own grandfather had worked for that department, though he'd never spoken of his research. "No," she whispered, pieces falling into place. "It can't be." The elderly woman nodded gravely. "You begin to understand. Your grandfather, Dr. William Johnson, was the lead scientist studying children with the voice gift. His research was meant to weaponize their abilities, to create human-animal communication that could deploy wildlife as military assets." Michael turned to his wife in shock. Avery had never mentioned this family connection, but the truth reflected in her face. "I didn't know," she said, tears streaming down her cheeks. "He never talked about his work. I only knew he was a behavioral scientist working for the government." "He closed the program," the woman continued, "when he understood what the children truly were, not weapons, but bridges between worlds that never should have separated. He hid his research, scattered the children to adoptive homes, and dedicated his remaining years to protecting them from discovery." Isabelle, still beside the golden bear, now spoke with a clarity that stunned her parents. Grandfather knew Mother carried sleeping gift. Not enough to show, just enough to pass to me. The revelation hit Avery like physical force. Her own inexplicable affinity for animals, her unusually acute hearing, her vivid dreams of running with wild creatures, all hints of a diluted version of Isabelle's abilities, passed down through bloodlines both human and something other. The gift awakens fully in the third generation, the woman explained, and only in times of great need when the balance between human and wild requires restoration. The golden bear rose to its full height and produced sounds that the woman translated. For too long, our worlds have drifted apart. Humans forget they are part of nature, not separate from it. The voiced ones help us remember how to speak to each other before it's too late. Too late for what? Michael asked, finding his voice at last. Instead of answering directly, the dimensional window shifted to show catastrophic visions, mass extinctions, ecological collapse, then human societies falling as the natural systems they depended on failed. This is not distant future, the woman said sadly. This begins within your daughter's lifetime, unless the conversation between human and wild resumes. Isabelle suddenly pointed toward the edge of the clearing, directly at Ethan's hiding place. He needs to see too, she called. The three who broke must help fix. The fox beside Ethan nudged him forward, leaving him no choice but to enter the clearing. The assembled bears turned to watch him, their collective gaze neither threatening nor forgiving, simply evaluating. I didn't mean to hurt the cub, Ethan said, his voice breaking. I wasn't thinking. I'm sorry. The mother bear from the drainage incident separated from the group, approaching with her cub beside her. Ethan fell to his knees, certain he was about to face retribution for his cruelty. Instead, both bears touched their noses to his forehead, mirroring Isabelle's earlier blessing. The harm you caused created the opportunity for healing, the woman translated as the mother bear produced complex sounds. Without your action, the voice might have remained dormant. Darkness sometimes serves light's purpose. Isabelle walked to Ethan's side, placing her small hand in his. 3 parts broken, 3 parts whole, she said cryptically. You, bear, me, all hurt, all healed. Now we need the other 2 boys. The implications dawned on Ethan. Jacob and Logan, they were part of this too. They're the other 2 who need to become one. Summoning bears is difficult, Isabelle explained with childlike simplicity. Opening path between worlds needs power from both sides. The hurt you caused the cub, the help I gave, together they made a window. 3 who broke must help 3 guardians come through. Guardians? Michael questioned. The golden bear produced more sounds, which the woman translated. 3 great guardians wait to cross when the path is prepared. Ancient beings who walked both worlds freely before humans closed their minds to understanding. They will help restore balance, teaching humans to hear nature's voice again. The dimensional windows flickered violently, showing immense bear-like figures unlike any known species. Larger, more evolved, radiating intelligence and power. These weren't simply animals, but something that existed at the intersection of physical and spiritual reality. The first guardians guided early humans, the woman explained, teaching them to survive in harmony with the wild. When humans turned from their teachings, the guardians retreated to the space between worlds, waiting for bridges to be rebuilt. Isabelle's role suddenly became clear to her parents. She wasn't just a child with unexplained abilities. She was the culmination of generations of gifts, intended to serve as a living bridge between separated realities. If I help bring guardians, Isabelle asked the golden bear directly, can I still be little girl too? The leader's response needed no translation. It gently nuzzled Isabelle, then gestured toward her parents, clearly indicating she belonged with them. Whatever cosmic role she might play, her humanity wasn't being stolen from her. The woman elaborated. The voice gift doesn't replace who you are, child. It adds to you. Your grandfather understood this too late. He thought the gifted children had to choose between worlds. They don't. They belong to both. Relief flooded Avery and Michael. Their greatest unspoken fear had been losing their daughter to whatever force was transforming her. The knowledge that Isabelle could fulfill this strange destiny while remaining their child offered comfort amid the impossible. "What happens now?" Michael asked. "The child has opened the first window through sound," the woman explained. "But to create a stable passage for the guardians requires more, specifically the combined effort of those who caused harm and those who healed it." Ethan understood immediately. "I need to bring Jacob and Logan here." "Yes," Isabelle confirmed. 3 who hurt, 3 who heal, 3 who guard, all become one voice. The golden bear produced a final series of sounds before the gathering began to disperse. The woman translated. "You have until the next alignment of 3 suns, 7 days from now. After that, the opportunity will pass, and the great unraveling will continue without intervention." As the bears melted back into the forest, the woman approached Isabelle's parents directly. "Your choice remains. You can refuse this path. Take Isabelle far away. Try to suppress her gift. Many parents of voiced ones have made this choice throughout history, hoping to give their children normal lives." "What happens if we do that?" Avery asked. "The gift finds expression somehow," the woman replied sadly. "Often in ways more painful than if it had been accepted and guided. And of course, without Isabelle's help, the guardian crossing cannot occur." "Meaning the ecological disasters we saw will happen," Michael concluded. "They have already begun," the woman corrected. "But yes, without intervention they will accelerate beyond recovery." As the woman turned to leave, Avery grabbed her arm. "Who are you? How do you know all this?" The woman's appearance briefly shimmered, revealing glimpses of amber eyes and features that seemed both human and ursine. "I was like Isabelle once, many years ago. I made my choice to serve as translator between worlds. Your daughter's path will be her own to determine, with your guidance." With that cryptic answer, she vanished into the forest, leaving the Carter family and Ethan alone in the clearing that now looked considerably more ordinary without its magical inhabitants. The journey back to Willowbrook seemed shorter somehow, as if the forest had compressed space to assist their return. Isabelle bounced happily between her parents, showing no trace of the ancient wisdom that had spoken through her in the clearing. She was once again simply a toddler, pointing at butterflies and asking for snacks. Only her amber eyes remained as evidence of her transformation, that and the occasional unconscious humming that made nearby plants lean toward her. Ethan walked slightly apart from the family, his mind racing with the immensity of what he'd witnessed and his role in the events to come. His phone showed dozens of missed calls from Jacob and Logan. Apparently, they'd woken to find him missing and feared the worst. "I have to convince them," he murmured to himself. "But how do I explain any of this?" Isabelle overheard and skipped back to take his hand. "Show them your eyes," she said cryptically. "My eyes?" Ethan repeated, confused. Isabelle reached up and touched his face gently. "Bear sees you now. You see Bear. Eyes remember." Ethan stopped walking and pulled out his phone, using the camera as a mirror. He staggered back in shock. The irises of his eyes had begun to change, flecks of amber appearing amid his natural brown color. "What's happening to me?" he whispered. "Bear blessing," Isabelle explained simply. "Started when Mother Bear touched your head. Now you can help others see too." Michael placed a steadying hand on the teenager's shoulder. "We're all part of something bigger than ourselves now, Ethan, for better or worse." As they approached the edge of the forest, reality came rushing back. Police sirens wailed in the distance. Helicopter rotors thumped overhead. Their disappearance had clearly been discovered, and the peaceful village of Willowbrook now resembled a militarized zone. They're afraid, Avery realized, watching armed personnel establishing perimeters. They don't understand what's happening, so they're responding with fear. Fear makes humans forget how to listen, Isabelle said, suddenly solemn again. That's why bears had to leave long ago. Too much fear, not enough listening. The four of them paused at the forest edge, reluctant to step back into the chaos of the human world with its cameras, questions, and authorities. The magical clarity of the Bear Council seemed distant now, like a dream being overtaken by harsh daylight. "I need to find Jacob and Logan," Ethan said urgently. "We only have 7 days. And we need to protect Isabelle," Michael added. "They'll want to take her away for testing after this disappearance." As they stood contemplating their next move, a sound rose from the village. Not sirens or helicopters, but a melody, faint at first, then growing stronger as more voices joined. The villagers of Willowbrook were singing. Sarah Mitchell stood in the village square, leading her neighbors in an ancient folk song about bears and children that hadn't been sung in generations. Beside her, Dr. Reeves directed her acoustic equipment skyward, amplifying the villagers' voices to counter the mechanical noise of the search operation. "They're calling us home," Avery realized, tears welling in her eyes. Isabelle smiled, her amber eyes gleaming. "See? Humans remember how to talk to bears too, just need to be reminded." The path forward wouldn't be easy. There would be authorities to face, explanations to fabricate, teenagers to convince. But watching the villagers use sound to counter fear, Michael felt the first real hope that Isabelle's mysterious mission might actually succeed. As they prepared to leave the forest's protection, the fox that had guided Ethan earlier reappeared briefly. It yipped once in farewell, then disappeared among the trees, where subtle golden shapes could be seen watching and waiting for the great guardian's return. 7 days remained until the next alignment of 3 suns. 7 days to heal the rift between worlds that should never have separated. 7 days for 3 who broke and 3 who healed to become one voice that could change everything. Isabelle squeezed her parents' hands tightly, then lifted her face to the sky and released a single, perfect note that temporarily silenced every other sound in Willowbrook. In that moment of acoustic clarity, bears throughout the forest answered in perfect harmony, their voices carrying across the valley like a promise. The conversation between human and wild had officially begun again. Section 5. On the 7th day, as dawn approached, the village of Willowbrook stood transformed. The military barricades that had briefly surrounded the Carter cottage were gone, replaced by a circle of villagers holding hands in silent vigil. News crews remained at a respectful distance, their cameras capturing what would soon become the most viewed live stream in internet history. At the center of it all stood Isabelle, no longer just a toddler with unusual abilities, but a bridge between worlds that had drifted too far apart. Her amber eyes glowed with inner light as she sang the musical patterns she'd first used to save the drowning cub. Beside her, Ethan, Jacob, and Logan formed a protective triangle, their own eyes now flecked with the same golden hue. The bear's blessing, spreading as promised. The past week had unfolded in ways no one could have predicted. Instead of trying to suppress the miracle emerging in their midst, the villagers of Willowbrook had embraced it. Sarah Mitchell had organized the community, sharing ancient stories passed down through generations about children who could speak to animals and times when humans and wildlife communicated freely. Dr. Reeves abandoned conventional research protocols in favor of simply listening. Her equipment had captured frequencies that defied analysis but somehow made sense to the heart. Rather than publishing papers, She had started teaching villagers how to hear the subtle harmonies in nature's background noise. Most remarkable was the transformation of Ethan, Jacob, and Logan. The teenagers who had caused the crisis through thoughtless cruelty had become Isabelle's most dedicated protectors. Under her guidance, they had spent days by the drainage pipe, using their own voices to call to the animal world in atonement. Slowly, painfully, they had learned to produce sounds that bridged the gap between human speech and natural acoustic patterns. Michael and Avery watched their daughter with pride tinged with awe. The choice the mysterious woman had offered, to hide Isabelle's gift or share it with the world, no longer seemed like a choice at all. Their daughter belonged to something larger than their family alone, though she remained their beloved child in all the ways that mattered. As the first hints of sunrise touched the eastern horizon, strange clouds began forming directly overhead. Not ordinary weather patterns, but swirling vortices that opened into impossible depths. The sky itself seemed to be creating windows similar to those they'd witnessed in the Bear Council clearing. Isabelle's song intensified, joined now by Ethan, Jacob, and Logan. Their combined voices produced harmonics that made the very air vibrate. From the forest edge, the bears emerged. First, the mother and her cub, then the golden-patched bears from the council, and finally the massive leader with fur that shimmered like captured sunlight. The villagers gasped but held their positions. Fear had given way to reverence in the days of preparation. They had watched Isabelle communicate with every living thing around her, witnessed plants grow in response to her touch, seen animals respond to her calls. What might have once been perceived as threatening now felt like a homecoming. Isabelle raised her small hands toward the dimensional windows opening above. "Three who broke," she called, her voice carrying impossible distances. "Three who healed." The mother bear and her cub stepped forward. "Three who guard." The swirling vortices pulsed in response. Enormous shadows appeared within the dimensional openings, the great guardians waiting to cross between worlds, ancient beings who had once guided humanity before the separation of realms had driven them into retreat. Their silhouettes suggested bears of impossible size and evolution, carrying wisdom accumulated over eons. "Remember how to listen," Isabelle commanded the gathered humans. "Remember how to speak." The entire village inhaled as one, then released a sound that came not from trained vocal cords but from some deeper, forgotten part of human consciousness. It wasn't language as modern minds understood it, but pure communicative intent, the root of all language before words created barriers. In that moment of perfect harmony between human voice and animal call, the dimensional windows fully opened. Light poured from the swirling vortices, temporarily blinding everyone present. When vision cleared, three magnificent beings stood among them. The great guardians, crossing between worlds for the first time in millennia. They resembled bears in basic form, but stood taller than any known species, with fur that captured and reflected light in hypnotic patterns. Their eyes held intelligence that felt ancient, yet familiar, as if humans had carried the memory of these beings in their collective unconscious throughout separation. Without words, the guardians communicated understanding that flowed directly into the minds of everyone present. They had come not to command or control, but to re-establish connection, to remind humanity of its place within nature rather than apart from it. The ecological disasters glimpsed in the Council's visions could still be averted, but only through renewed conversation between all living things. Isabelle approached the largest guardian without fear, reaching up to touch its luminous fur. "Will you teach us again?" she asked, her voice small yet filled with the authority of her gift. The guardian lowered its massive head in acknowledgement. A promise was exchanged without words. Knowledge for commitment, wisdom for change, patience for growth. The bridge between worlds would remain open, maintained by those with the voice gift, but the work of healing the separation would belong to all. Ethan stepped forward, followed by Jacob and Logan. "We broke something beautiful through ignorance," he said, his voice steady despite tears streaming down his face. "We promised to spend our lives helping rebuild." The teenage boys who had caused such harm through thoughtless cruelty now stood transformed, their eyes reflecting golden light, their souls open to understanding beyond their years. The mother bear approached them, her cub at her side, and touched each one's forehead in final forgiveness and blessing. As the sun fully rose, something extraordinary happened in the sky above Willowbrook. Not 3 suns this time, but a single brilliant light that somehow contained multitudes, unity born from division, wholeness from fragmentation. It bathed the village in radiance that felt both ancient and new, like returning to a home long forgotten. Isabelle turned to her parents, suddenly just their little girl again despite the amber eyes and impossible wisdom. "Can we have pancakes now?" she asked, her voice carrying the musical lilt that would remain with her always, but framing a request that reminded them she was still a child with a child's simple desires. Michael laughed through tears, scooping his daughter into his arms. "Yes, sweetheart, we can have pancakes." The great guardians dispersed throughout the forest, their presence both visible and invisible, part of this world yet connected to realms beyond understanding. The bears returned to their territories, though the boundaries between human and wild spaces would never again be quite so rigid. In the months and years that followed, Willowbrook became known as the place where the conversation resumed. Visitors came from around the world to learn the forgotten language of interspecies communication. Some discovered latent abilities similar to Isabelle's, though none quite matched her natural fluency. Others simply learned to listen more deeply to the world around them. Isabelle grew, as all children do, attending school, making friends, experiencing the ordinary joys and sorrows of human life. But each day, she also spent time by the drainage pipe where everything had begun, singing to the wild and translating its responses for any who wished to learn. The 3 teenagers who had started the chain of events through cruelty became her most dedicated students and protectors. Ethan eventually founded a wildlife communication research center. Jacob developed techniques for using sound to heal environmental damage. Logan documented everything in films that changed how humanity viewed its relationship with nature. And deep in the forest, in the space between worlds where the Bear Council gathered, the elderly woman who had guided them all smiled in satisfaction. The ancient wheel had not just turned. It had found a new path forward, spiraling toward possibility rather than repeating history's mistakes. The cub that had once been flushed down a drainage pipe in thoughtless cruelty grew into a magnificent bear with a golden patch over its heart. It often visited the edge of the village, calling to Isabelle with sounds that made humans weep without understanding why. Their duet, child and bear, voice and echo, reminded all who heard it that separation is an illusion, that all living things speak a common language if only we remember how to listen. In moments of perfect stillness, when the modern world's noise subsided, that language could sometimes be heard. In the wind through trees, in water over stones, in the heartbeat shared by all living creatures. It had been there all along, waiting patiently for humanity to remember its first and most important conversation. The conversation that, thanks to a bear cub's distress and a human baby's compassion, had finally resumed.